Hello and welcome back to another Torah Tuesday. We are still in Genesis chapter 11, exploring the Tower of Babel story. And one thing that I discovered as I was working on this is that the tower is not quite so central as I thought. In fact, it mentions the city more often than the tower. The tower is just one aspect of this city building project. But one question that I've been asking as I worked on this story is, what was this tower for? What did the people think that they were doing when they built this tower? If you're like me, then you have grown up assuming that the tower was a plan for the people to get to heaven. They wanted to be where the gods were, so they built this really tall tower so that they could climb it and ascend to where the gods were. That's what I had always assumed. But there are actually a couple of other theories that I think are more persuasive. So the first thing to note is that the Hebrew word for tower in this story is migdal. And migdal is a common word that's used to describe a watchtower that would be built either in the center of a field so that maybe your grapes are ripe and they're just about ready for picking and you don't want invaders to come steal your grapes. You'd build a watchtower in the center of your vineyard, and then you would have somebody up there all the time who's watching to make sure that no one is stealing grapes. So it's possible that the tower that they build in Genesis 11 is actually a military fortification rather than a means of them ascending to the gods. They are not wanting to be scattered. And how are you scattered? You're scattered when someone attacks you and you don't withstand the invasion. So they build their city in a valley plain, and they build a tower so that they could see the enemy from a long way off. So that's one possibility. Another possibility that's been suggested by scholars is that the thing they're building is a ziggurat. A ziggurat is a giant brick structure that has a staircase going up the side. And you might be interested to learn that a ziggurat is not a building that people enter. It's actually just filled with rubble on the inside. It's a solid, completely solid structure. The structure is merely to support the staircase. But they're not built so that people can go up the stairs. They're built in order that the gods can come down. So people would build a ziggurat in ancient times next to a temple and a garden. And the idea was that they would build the temple. They want the gods to dwell in the temple. And so they would build a ziggurat to facilitate the travel of the gods down to the temple. Sometimes they would even put on top of the ziggurat a little motel room kind of thing. And they didn't actually do any rituals on top. It wasn't a temple place. It was just there so that the gods could travel more easily. So if this is true, if it's a ziggurat that they're building, and if the ziggurat is so that the gods will come down, then the idea would be that they're trying to achieve divine legitimation of their civilization. They want the gods to put their stamp of approval on their empire and make them invincible. The strongest clue in favor of this interpretation, I think a military reading is possible. That it's a watchtower. I think that's possible, especially given that Nimrod, who built Babel, is mentioned in Genesis 10. He's called a mighty warrior and a warrior hunter. And so there's already some violent overtones, and it's possible that they're preparing for war. But either way, we are told that Yahweh comes down. So that if they're building a ziggurat so that the gods will come down, it in fact works, and Yahweh does come down in verse 5, but the result is precisely what they were trying to avoid. Rather than coming and legitimizing their culture and their one language community, God actually scatters them, which is precisely what they're trying to avoid. They say, "Let us make for ourselves a name lest we be scattered across the face of the whole earth." And the end of the story tells us, from there Yahweh caused them to scatter across the face of the whole earth. So precisely what they didn't want to happen is what God does. But what I love especially that I discovered as I was working on this story is the wordplay. It is so clever and so sophisticated. So they say in verse 4, "Come, let us build for ourselves a city and a watchtower." This phrase, "let us build for ourselves," is nivne lanu. Nivne lanu. Then God says in verse 7, come, let us go down and let us mix up their lip. So let us mix in Hebrew is navla. So they want to build and he mixes, and the two rhyme with each other. So nivne lanu and navla. Do you hear how they kind of sound similar? And then this is even better. In verse 9, therefore he called its name Babel, which in Hebrew we'd pronounce it Bavel. Bavel is the name of the city, because there Yahweh balal. He belals the languages of Bavel. So it's the same it's the same two consonants, but instead of BBL, it's BLL. So he's literally mixing up the letters of their words, and that's why they are defeated. That's how he defeats them. So the language that's used to tell the story mirrors the action that God does in the story, which is so cool. So they're looking for God's stamp of approval, but instead God frustrates their plans. And again, if you are an Israelite and you have suffered under Babylonian oppression, this is a fun story for you to read because it shows so cleverly how God undermines world empires to accomplish what he wants. It's often been thought that when God scatters them, this is a judgment. But recent scholars have suggested that perhaps God's scattering is actually a blessing. He's restoring them to what he intended from the beginning, which was for them to fill the earth and subdue it. Not subdue each other, but subdue the earth. In other words, cultivate it, care for it, steward it well. And they will be able to do that better if they're not living in an oppressive empire. So there's some food for thought. I'd love to hear what you think of these ideas. Go ahead and leave me a comment. This has been a mind-blowing journey for me to rediscover how deep this story is. What seemed so simple is not all that simple. Have a great week.